I apologize. What makes a person use a different language? I've done cognitive experience about that experiment. Let's say there's a new sickness called the French sickness. And what happens is a baby is born and they can learn how to speak French easily. It comes natural to them. There's no problems. But when they try to learn English, they can't. They struggle. What do you think most people would do if if their child had the French sickness? I think they would move to France. Or maybe they'd send their child to a bilingual school with French and English. Imagine if they had an English implant, quote unquote, which allows kids who have the quote unquote French sickness to learn English easier. There's a 50% fluency rate, but 50% still struggle with English. I don't think parents would do that if there was a 50% chance. They would just send their child to France, or they would all just go to France and learn French. In my teaching, I find that that's not the response when it comes to deaf kids. It's just sad. Hello, I see a friendly face. It's a long meeting. Yes. Okay, well, thank you. And I have a question. That's about language deprivation syndrome and different things about that. What about late language acquisition? Because some of my students, well, they didn't learn language in a formal setting. So to have proper language education, what kind of label would you give them? What if they were hearing and that was the case? What are your thoughts on that? Well, that subject matter can be included in LDS because children like that, adults like that, are still developing strong skills in that language. They don't have a strong L1, and I'm not being mean. It's just part of the process of becoming fluent. Their language might not be as clear to understand. And if they didn't have evidence of problems before, then that could be the explanation for their language struggles, language deprivation syndrome. All right, thank you so much. Absolutely. Hello. I was one of your clients 15 years ago, and it's been such a long time since I've seen you. All right, I have a question. When I was growing up, I am deaf. I went to different schools. I was mainstreamed. I have a cochlear implant. Excuse me, I've seen people who have cochlear implants, and I've wondered about it. And I went into a military office, and I asked them if I got a cochlear implant, would they still let me into the military? And they said no. So I was wondering, with a cochlear implant, is it really easier, and does it really create equality in different settings, like going into interviews, like a military interview or something like that? And there's different things that can be given, like hearing aids and things like that, but can you really hear naturally with that? Does it really make things easier? Well, let's define disability. What makes somebody have a disability? And what does society view that as? If all the doors are closed, if all the doors are closed in a mental setting, so to speak, they can't break through. Well, I graduated already. I'm deaf, and I was in this interview and I thought that if I went in with the cochlear implant, maybe it would have made things smoother. Okay, well, it's hard to change the way you enter into the military without language in general. Yeah, that's what I thought. But the doctor viewed me as somebody who has a sickness and asked me to get a cochlear implant, and I thought that that wasn't necessary. I'm fine without it. The doctor really encouraged me, though. I didn't want to waste the money if it's not really going to happen. Well, that's like comparing things being easier if you were black. Would it be harder versus with a white person? Can you change white people or change black people to become white people? Does it make it better for them? It just depends on what society accepts and doesn't accept. I wish there was a policy that required two important points: equality, especially for deaf people and deaf culture. We're getting closer to that now. Just like you were saying, we can have an interview fine and you're deaf with a hearing person. That's a great example. Yeah, no matter what setting I'm in, most of the time I can have people understand me. It's just about being able to know how to interact with the world, and then things open up for you. Helps my confidence level for sure to be able to communicate. Right, that's the product of having a strong L1 language. Do you guys know about... It's a very interesting example. In the 16th century, people from England migrated to an island. Oh, it's called Martha's Vineyard. Do you guys know about that? Well, most of the inhabitants were deaf. It was a familial trait that got passed down over generations. Many people were deaf there. So many people had language, sign language specifically, and lots of people knew how to sign. This was before American Sign Language was established in America. There were different migrations going on, especially with deaf people, but ultimately they found that most communicative access was at Martha Vineyards because everyone knew how to sign. And it's unfortunate now that things are different, but that was a great example of, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I feel that when we're presented with the opportunity to communicate in sign language in a workplace, doctor, it's lucky to have that respect between people. Maybe in a conference meeting, you can communicate, but if there's no respect, that hinders the process. Thank you. Awesome. My name is Max. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I just have a quick question about sign language and literacy. Is there any correlation with the development for an L1? I think it's interesting because reading at a young age helps with a multitude of things, and I just want to know your take. Yes, reading helps with so many cognitive processes. But you have to understand, reading is great. But you have to have that L1 first. Without it, reading does nothing. People who have a strong L1 who can sign first must develop that, and then you can encourage to develop language through other avenues, like hearing if they have something like a hearing person. Just like with a hearing person, if you teach them the word cat, They hear the word and then you have to associate it. Okay, yep, I understand. Just like with reading. So, if a deaf person has a strong L1, they can develop strong English skills as well that can help them read. Same concept. Thank you so much. Ooh, come on, we need more people in the line. Gosh, you shared so many points that I really enjoyed learning about. Thank you so much for coming. So I was curious, where else do you lecture and how long have you been doing it and things like that? There's a poster in the hospital that gives a brief little bit about me with some short points. Started in DC and then grew from there. I did research. I did different projects associated to my doctoral studies. Okay. Also, I've worked with children for a really long time, especially children with disabilities, children who graduated. I graduated from Gallaudet in the 90s. And I saw that kids really do improve with sign language. Their confidence boosts and a lot of things start to go right as well. And from my experiences here, I've seen that there's less opportunities for kids to develop an L1. So what would you say about a baby who was born deaf and hearing parents who may not know what to do? What would you say to them? And there's a lot of avenues to treat this with medicine, and of course, ultimately, it's the parent's decision. But what would that information look like? What's the bottom line that you would tell them? Maybe you have a family member who has no idea about deafness, doesn't have the information. They don't have that background. So what's involved with meeting with those deaf clientele? Giving them the facts and the research that you've done and telling them how important it is to their education to develop an L1 and how to navigate that with their deaf child and ultimately have access. Maybe they don't know how to sign and they're still new signers. Or they sign and then they start talking and walk away. And then they come back and sign briefly to the child, maybe in a group setting. At the same time, I feel that it's important that research proves that education is improved with a strong L1. Language deprivation syndrome, that's included in disabilities and developing language later in life, may influence somebody, but what would you say for them to improve their cognitive background? If something happened that spread into the community, what would you look back and say about yourself and how you affected that regarding a deaf child and language deprivation syndrome? Would you protest what that family did with their child if they did something that you didn't advise? That's a wonderful question. I'm going to add to that with my research and post it. My answer is no. Kids with cognitive disabilities or hearing disabilities, they are responsible for themselves. Their parents are responsible for them. I can't change people's mentality. I can't change their decision. If they made a decision, they'll go along with it. They'll make alterations to do what they think is natural. But later when that child grows up and they become more aware, they may thank their parents. But oftentimes they won't. When kids are born with mental disabilities, that can be a shock factor, something that parents can decide to change or decide to cope with. Maybe make small changes throughout the kid's lifetime. Later, when that kid is all grown up, they may thank their parents for any kind of modifications, but most likely not. That's just part of what society views as normal. The labels that they put on people versus what they view as normal. That's an example that I'm hoping to show. We have to understand that things involved in processing don't always connect solely with the biological aspects. There's confidence, there's development, there's delay, there's language delay, which is awful. Language deprivation is awful. So I'm hoping to convey that it's not just that simple. What you said about kids speaking one word, and then being exposed to sign language and building that foundation, I mean, come on. That was great. Yeah, I'm not saying that I'm against cochlear implants. I'm just supporting a strong L1. I'm supporting language access, language acquisition, and I'm proposing that kids who don't have that will fall behind. Thank you. I work for an agency that provides services in the home for kids and their families. And I've seen a lot of kids with varying abilities. We see kids who have 3 languages, who have sign languages, who are mainstreamed, kids who have parents who try and force them to speak, just a variety of things. When you said about L1 and how not having a strong L1 can be destructive, that's really proof enough to me to show that you can't force your kid to do anything that doesn't come natural to them with sign language. What do you think about that on a culture aspect, or is that a gray area? What do you think about that label with culture? I think every person is different. You may be able to force someone to do something, or you may not. You may take an approach that is apathetic to the situation. But whatever that person decides is how that person develops. That's why it's so variable. I know it doesn't sound good. You might not understand, but it's a touchy topic. So is that something we should continue to measure? Yes, yeah. Can you give an example? Like, I don't know about those families, but there's things that you can and can't do, and well, it just has to do with socializing, communicating. You're talking about that aspect, right? I suppose. Yes. What's important is that we do see a correlation. And there is an average, which I'm not saying applies to everybody, but there's a correlation, a downward slope. Thank you. With natural development and from age 6 months and going forward, we see that kids who are exposed to an L1 early prefer that certain language as opposed to later in life when they're exposed to a second language. If you label a child who's been born a certain way, deaf, whatever it is, and they're late deaf and they're learning language at 3 or 4, that's the beginning of language deprivation. Age 5 without if they're already 5 without full access to language, the effects start to kick in. I guess what I'm saying is that people who take that apathetic approach, would you advise them to be more encouraging for learning language? What do you think? Well, when kids are experiencing language deprivation, it's like a language emergency. If we're looking at 6 months versus 4, 6 months there is no emergency. The kid has time to get immersed into a language, to develop those skills, and to socialize. That window closes so slowly as time goes on for language to acquiesce in the child. But by age 12, 14, 20, that time for language exposure is so late. We see that in rural areas too, where there's not enough language acquisition to become fluent. The vocabulary isn't there. The cognitive ability to learn words isn't there. Vocabulary isn't there. And the problems just keep stacking up against themselves. You wonder why this happens, and it's the culture. You know that how the culture of, that house next to that house where everybody knows each other. The culture can't be removed. That's why we see it more in those rural areas. Awesome, thank you so much. Hi, so I work at a school and I have 2 things that I wanted to ask. You can pick which question you want to answer, I suppose. When you were talking about the National Association for the Deaf and different organizations that involve deafness and CDIs, things about the deaf world, all included into that, and to help quote unquote deaf people. So I just wanted to hear more about your thoughts on that. And then the second thing was about Gallaudet and the program for deaf infants and families, and where to learn sign language or language in general, and what to do if your baby is deaf or hard of hearing. And I wanted to say I've worked with students all over the country who have language delays. I've tested them, and they really miss the social aspect. They come to me and they ask, parents come to me and ask, how can I help my kid with that? And it's hard to give them an affirmative answer. Because if you miss that window, what do you do when it's gone? It's hard for me to establish some kind of test for that and say that it's too late or not too late. And if a child has missed it and they're limited now, what do you say? What do you do? Well, it's awful to say that, but sometimes you have to. We have to remember that the mind is like a painting. You can come close to fixing things, but sometimes not always. Same with sign language or learning language in general. You can make a beautiful painting. But if someone has language deprivation, it's biological. There's nothing about that we can do. It just happens. It's very important for the person to know what's happening before it's too late. Then therapy can be done. I've seen 14 and 15-year-olds respond to therapy. If you associate the word with the meaning, those issues can be fixed little by little. It's shocking when somebody finds out that their child has language deprivation. It's not healthy, right? So my point is that it's good to know what's happening before it happens and know the person. Then you can get them into treatment. And they can have a better quality of life. That's tough when you have a diploma, you've passed a test, you're certified. You should be able to read. Your child should be able to read at a certain level and follow the path to success. Like with closed captions and subtitles, it's just difficult. Now there's evidence that the brain can expand and become knowledgeable. Even if there's a delay, it can still expand. It can still form new connections. I want to inform my parents about that research and explain it a little bit more. It's a good way to show what happens when you miss that window and what happens to the mind. All right, am I done? Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Toko. I'm a student. Started learning ASL this year, so sorry if I make mistakes. I was wondering, as a student who wants to help people like me, who were born hearing, but then grew up with hearing loss. Me too. Oh, good. Yes, me too. Me too. Good. My family wants me to learn and to study, to adapt and fit in with hearing culture. They think that I need to be fixed, that it's a problem. I was wondering, how can a student like me, other students too, in a class or other situations, help people if they're not being helped themselves by doctors or not supported, or other people in general? I think there are many ways that you can help people. You can help your parents imagine exactly what's going on with you. Maybe they can better fit your needs. For example, my parents, they were all teachers. So they didn't quite understand how I could be successful if I couldn't talk and speak and teach like them. And hearing loss is a different experience than it being deaf. Hearing loss can lead to serious deprivation too. Studies comparing people who have been blind, become paralyzed, and people who then become deaf, they say that it's actually the hardest experience becoming deaf. You see people become happier as they go blind. That's interesting. And I think it's funny because really we know why. Blind people are cut off from things, but deaf people are cut off from people. Becoming blind means you don't care about material possessions. You have a better quality of life interacting with people. So as for the people you're referring to, it's their decision and it's their life too. How can I help the culture become more accepting? And doctors too. There's a lot of ways that you can change society. For example, I don't view deafness as a limit. So I go and I do things that people might not think that I can do. Like I protest. I can picket if I wanted to. That's one way that you can help people see. You can have exposure for that kind of thing. And also just having a dialogue, having a conversation about it too. Hello, I'm Sue from RIA. I haven't been here, I think, in 33 years, so I'm looking around and I've seen many of you. And I think one of you who were standing up with the black hair, what was your name? Martha. Okay. Yeah, you were really telling a really touching story. And I just want to let you know that I'm a teacher and I've seen that kind of thing before as well. And I'm happy that it hasn't happened here yet.